Hi, I'm Chris Sangster, and welcome back to the studio. Today, let's talk about gain staging. For some reason, this is a hotly debated topic in the online music community. Some people will say it's the one thing holding you back from great mixes, and others say it's the vestigial tail of analog recording, so you shouldn't think about it at all. As usual, the truth lies somewhere in between. So, what is gain staging? Gain staging is managing the level of audio signals throughout an audio system to ensure optimal sound quality without distortion or excessive noise. And the key word there is optimal. It is not about making sure all of your tracks hit some arbitrary loudness number, despite what you may have heard. It's just making sure that your tracks are not too loud so that nothing distorts, and not too quiet so that all of your plugins and hardware are working properly and not introducing any noise. Simple enough, right? So, where does all the confusion and online ire come from? Well, I think the transition from a purely analog mixing workflow to a digital mixing workflow is where the trouble really began. See, in an analog workflow, gain staging was much more critical than it is in a digital workflow. This is because analog hardware was designed to work properly at specific input gain levels. And if it was fed too much signal, it would cause audible distortion. Because of the limitations of the hardware, engineers had to be meticulous about gain staging if they wanted their equipment to work properly. But things are different in the digital world. The physical limitation of how much voltage a set of electrical components can handle has been replaced with the constraints of a computer's processing power. Especially in Logic Pro's current 64-bit floating point architecture, we have massive amounts of headroom to play with, and there is no perfect signal level it was designed to operate at. Remember, Logic is not measuring voltage, it is processing audio as digital samples. So we're comparing apples to oranges when assessing the validity of gain staging in analog to digital. What we need to do is focus on gain staging in two parts when recording in a DAW. The first does happen in the analog world, and the gain staging here is massively important. That is setting the correct input level for your microphone or instrument. The microphone preamp or the line level input on an audio interface does have a hard limit of acceptable voltage, and it will distort if fed too much level. That's clipping, that's bad, we don't want that. Conversely, if the signal level is too low and you have to crank the input level up, there will be noise introduced into the recording as a result of that high gain setting. So, knowing how to set your equipment up properly so that you're getting the sweet spot of signal level where everything is loud enough to be heard and there's no noise introduced, but nothing will distort, is so important. Fundamentally one of the most important things in recording. But in this video, I want to focus on the second part of gain staging inside the digital realm, in the computer. And for this, I'm going to use an example that I think will be super familiar to most of you. You've recorded and produced your song. It's sounding pretty good, and now it's time to mix it to really make it shine. You're about to dive in and start moving faders and adding plugins, but then you remember you saw this one video about how if you don't gain stage your tracks, you won't get a pro mix, but you can't remember if he said put them all at -18 or do something else. So in a panic, you just shut your laptop and you don't come back to the song for another 2 weeks. I see you. I've been there. In order to avoid that panic, I've developed a no-nonsense process for gain staging that I always go through before starting a mix. And this works whether I'm mixing my own production like I'm showing here, or mixing tracks that a client sent to me. The first step is to go to the mix menu and enable pre-fader metering. You will notice when you do this, the meters and faders switch sides in the mixer window. This lets you know you're in pre-fader mode. And this allows you to see the level of the tracks without accounting for the position of the faders. This is a more true representation of the actual signal level of each recorded track. Now, an important note here. Pre-fader metering still takes into account the level changes that happen as a result of the plugins, so it's not the same as a true input level. In order to get a better picture of the actual level of each track, after switching to pre-fader metering, we must also bypass all plugins and sends on each track. Then we're simply going to play the track from start to finish. We don't even have to listen to it if we don't want to. We're playing through the song so we can get this number right here on each track. This left-hand box above each fader is the peak level that the track hit during playback. It is the loudest the track was in the song. And this is the crucial piece of information we need. So click on one of these boxes to reset them and then play all the way through the entirety of the song. What we want to do next is set each track so that the peak level that's reading out in that left-hand box is somewhere between -18 dBs and -6 dBs. Why this range? For starters, it will leave us plenty of headroom on all our buses so as to not cause digital clipping. But more importantly, it will help us optimize our plugins. I spoke before about how gain staging in the digital domain is working towards a different goal than gain staging in the analog domain. But there's one pretty big exception to that: analog modeling plugins. And I personally use a lot of them. These plugins may or may not have been designed to work best at the same input level as the analog gear that they're emulating. You'd honestly just have to check the manual on each plugin for that information, but you don't really need to worry about that. The much more important thing that virtually all of them do is distort. So making sure that all of the tracks are not peaking louder than -6 will make sure that there is not unintentional distortion added to the sound when an analog emulating plugin is added to the track. Once we have all those peak numbers showing, we simply go through each track and see if the peak number is within our acceptable -18 to -6 range. If it's not, we make an adjustment to that track. How we make that adjustment depends on if it's a MIDI track or an audio track. For example, the first track outside of the range in this session is this live hi-hat track, which is an audio track. It's measuring at -2 dBs. To bring this down into the acceptable range, I like to use the gain setting inside of the region inspector. Just click on the channel strip or the track header, which will select all of the regions in the track, then come to the region inspector and type in the gain adjustment. Just do some simple math here. Subtract the nearest whole number that will get us within the acceptable range. It doesn't have to be exact. So for this one, I'm going to type in -5 in the gain control, which will net us a -7 dB peak value for this track. We then continue on down the mixer, making adjustments to the tracks that are outside of the range. The trap hat track is peaking all the way up at +4.2, so I'll bring its gain down by -12. You could also achieve the same thing by using the gain tool, but personally, I think typing the number in is easier than clicking and dragging with the gain tool, but it's whatever works best for you. Now, the bass track in this song is peaking at -0.6, but it's a MIDI track, so we can't reduce its gain by using the region inspector. Instead, we have to put the gain plugin as the first plugin in the channel strip. This will not change the sound of the instrument or the velocity of the MIDI notes, but it will just reduce the gain before it hits any other plugins, and that's what we're looking for. I'll set the gain plugin to -6 to get us in that acceptable range. Then I'll continue on until I have adjusted every individual track that fell outside of the range. Again, this is any track below -18 dBs or above -6 dBs. Once we have made all of the necessary adjustments, I'll play the song through one more time just to double check my work, and then re-enable all the plugins and sends and switch back to post-fader metering. At this point, we're good to carry on mixing. But there's one more important point to make about gain staging in the digital domain. The starting level of each track is not the only opportunity to refine and optimize the gain staging. In fact, we can optimize the gain staging coming out of every plugin if we need to. That's where the staging part of the term comes from, right? There are many stages in an audio system where the level may need to be optimized. Virtually every plugin out there has some type of output gain control. And this can be used to control the level going into the next plugin in the signal chain. It's good practice to make sure that a plugin is not changing the overall level of a track. This massively helps with A being your mix moves, but also ensures that the gain staging we just set up at the beginning of mixing stays intact throughout a mix. There are occasions where I personally break this rule, not gonna lie. But when I do, I always keep in mind how that extra level boost might impact the performance of the next plugin in the chain. And with some plugins, this is more important than others. A great example of this are two plugins that I use on my mix bus in pretty much every single mix. First is the UAD Ampex ATR 102 tape machine emulation. If I crank the input on it, we can hear how easily it starts to distort and affect the sound. But if I don't drive enough signal into it, we aren't getting that magical 3D effect that I love so much about this plugin. So it's crucial to ensure that it's getting the right amount of signal. This plugin has a very specific range on the VU meter where it sounds best. And that is both on the input and output side, peaking around 0. Anything much above that starts to oversaturate and then distort. Contrast this with another go-to Mixbus plugin for me, the Slate Digital Virtual Console Collection. It also has a sweet spot of level. However, for this plugin, it's with the needle living inside of the red range and peaking up to +3 without the overload light coming on though. And since the VCC comes before the Ampex on my mix bus, it's very important that I set the output of the VCC in such a way that it doesn't drive too much signal into the Ampex and cause it to distort. So as you can see, it is really important to know the subtleties of the plugins you're using and how to optimize each in terms of gain staging. Once you've gone through the process outlined and considered if there are any adjustments needed to optimize the analog emulating plugins you already have on your tracks, you're ready to move on to the next phase of mixing. And if you're interested in learning what that next phase is and the entire process I use to guarantee professional results for my mixing clients, then I've got a great offer to tell you about. My mixing course, Mixing Decoded, is on sale this week only in celebration of my wedding. Next Thursday, I will be tying the knot with my lovely fiance, Sydney, and I thought there's no better way to celebrate true love than by running a flash sale on an online mixing course. In all seriousness though, it is the best sale I've ever offered on Mixing Decoded. It's 20% off until next Sunday. So if you've been curious in the past, or if this is the first time you're hearing about it, or you just want to get me a wedding gift, this week's the best time to check it out. Link is in the description box and pinned in the top comment. All the information you need is at that link. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you at the studio next time. Thanks.